Thank you so much for coming. We're so glad you can be here and join us this evening. This is a very special occasion. My name is Mary Ann Mead, and it's my honor to work here at the Southwest Harbor Public Library. I want to take this opportunity to thank the countless community members here and away for supporting the library. We couldn't offer the services and the programs that we do without your support. So thank you all so much. Before I introduce this evening's guest, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping items. We will be recording this event. So that's number one. And also, if you have questions during the presentation, please submit them to the Q&A feature, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Kate Pickup McMullen, one of my wonderful co-workers, will facilitate the Q&A after the presentation. In case you don't know, this program is part of the World in Your Library program, made possible through the Maine Humanities Council and the Margaret Chase Smith Foundation. So we're so grateful to them. As the library celebrates its 125th birthday, and the state of Maine celebrates its 200th, it's important to acknowledge that we sit upon land that was once Wabanaki, that the history of this place we love did not begin with colonization. As we reflect on who we are and where we want to go, we need to not only remember the Native history, but to have an awareness of the Native present and future narrative. To that end, we bring you this evening's guest, Dr. Darren Ranco, who joins us from the University of Maine in Orono. Dr. Ranco holds a joint appointment in the Department of Anthropology, the George Mitchell Center for Environmental and Watershed Research, and in Native American programs, where he serves as chair of Native American programs and coordinator of Native American research. He's also a member of the Penobscot Indian Nation. Welcome, Darren.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Hopefully everyone can hear me and see my opening slide. I'm sure the moderators will tell me otherwise if they can. It's my honor and privilege to present some work that, while I'm presenting it, is collective work across not only, and I have on the title slide a really knowledgeable person who also happens to be my graduate student, Natalie Michelle, who helped with a fair amount of this data collection. But it really reflects engagement that we at the university and with our partners in the tribes here in the state. It's just one aspect of our ongoing research partnerships. So I'm really excited about sharing this, and it's just a small part. And hopefully it will be illuminating for everyone. So I will start. I want to start with some basic ideas around climate justice, just as, to set up what I'm going to talk about tonight. I think, as environmental justice and climate justice have come together in the last decade, Indigenous people have been at the forefront of this work. And we can see this in Maine and elsewhere. Basic concepts: some groups of people will be more impacted by climate change than others. I think people understand that. And then secondly, a just society will build this disproportionate impact into our climate mitigation and adaptation policies. So those are just really basic ideas that with the challenges of climatic change, we have to really recognize who is most vulnerable, which people and cultures, and obviously I'm going to really emphasize Indigenous people as a key category worldwide, as well as here in Maine. But I really want to just call out those two basic principles, and that a just society, that we would think about these disproportionate impacts as we think about both the mitigation and adaptation policies. And I'm going to really talk about adaptation and not so much about mitigation. The most recent national climate assessment that highlights for the first time a really deep engagement with Indigenous people was published in 2018. And sorry, this is slides with a lot of words on them. You know, you get a PhD. I'm going to jam in a bunch of words. Hopefully there'll be some more interesting slides later. One of the messages, there are three key messages from this national climate assessment, and this really motivates this work. The first of which is that Indigenous livelihoods and economies are at risk because of climatic change. So this is the idea of livelihoods and economies, which involves fishing, hunting, even things like recreation and tourism enterprises. So as the landscape changes, these will be impacted. But that, of course, Indigenous peoples' economies rely on but face institutional barriers too in terms of our self-determination, sovereignty, and our ability to manage resources. So moving forward, I strongly urge everyone to support tribal sovereignty, both here in Maine for our Wabanaki Tribal Nations here, but also elsewhere. It's very important to addressing these institutional barriers. The second piece, and this really is critical as well, is that the physical, mental, and Indigenous values based health are at risk as well. So beyond the physical and both health in terms of ecosystem health and human health are the impacts that threaten cultural sites, practices, relationships, ceremonies, other kind of elements of our cultural heritage and identities that are also part of our psychological and overall community well-being. These are also threatened. And then lastly, the third message is that adaptation, disaster management, displacement, community-led relocations are a critical part of what Indigenous people face. So this is about the institutional barriers that exist that severely limit the adaptive capacities of a lot of people, not just Indigenous people, but obviously we recognize that wealthy people and people not tied to their natural resources to feed themselves and for their cultures will be much more will have an easier time adapting to climatic change. So this tie between us and our identities and our territory and resources is a critical part of what's threatened. And of course, successful adaptation in Indigenous context relies on our knowledge as Indigenous people, and you'll see how we're employing that in this work that we're doing for climate change adaptation. Just here's a first more interesting slide. So you can see the percentage of Indigenous people across the country. You will see that there's a little bit of darker greens here in Maine. Obviously that's for us as Wabanaki people. So that's a really important context to understand where we live. The other places, Oklahoma, the Southwest, upper Midwest shouldn't be that surprising. Also, and I think this is just a really important concept that is in a national climate assessment, is this wheel of vulnerability, which has both contemporary and colonial legacies to it. That there is a set of vulnerabilities that exists for Indigenous households, communities, regional systems, ecosystems, and infrastructures, as well as essential services. That these wheels are both historic and the way that these feed into one another are both historic and ongoing, and are part of colonial legacies of underdevelopment and theft of Indigenous lands, the forced assimilation of Indigenous peoples and cultures, et cetera, et cetera. For our work, we really don't use the notion of vulnerability as our key access point. Instead, we think about it as resilience. So the key to adaptation climate adaptation for indigenous people is about attaining or achieving or maintaining resilience in the face of other kinds of challenges. And this really emphasizes both a top-down and bottom-up frames to sort of communities controlling the knowledge input and output, so we can adapt in the ways that we seek as climate adaptation becomes more and more a necessity. In the first stages, as we did in this work, is to identify community assets and keys to resilience, which are often in our communities and cultures, in our ties to place as Wabanaki people. So just as a framing of climate adaptation in the Dawnland, our work at the university, and this is, Natalie and myself and a whole host of others became involved in this work with a Bureau of Indian Affairs grant that the Passamaquoddy tribe, Pleasant Point, Sabayak, got about 4 or 5 years ago. And the framing of this work was to create positive impacts for all of the tribal nations here in Maine, and to create this baseline of sort of culturally relevant climate adaptation plans that are driven by community preferences, all the things that we talked about in terms of adaptive resilience, and to address climatic impacts to Wabanaki health, such as, and these are all the things that we know are coming: increased pathogens, destruction of tribal infrastructure, loss of habitat and subsistence resources. All these things are coming. All the models show that. And since 2012, the Passamaquoddy tribe, Pleasant Point, Sabayak, has been the leader, partly because in 2012, the FEMA came through and worked with all the tribes here to do emergency preparedness and response planning. And that was the first time climate became part of this work by FEMA with the tribes. And the models that were presented in 2012 showed a fair amount of the infrastructure at Passamaquoddy, Pleasant Point, Sabayak Reservation were really threatened by sea level rise. As many of you know, they're right next to Eastport over on the coast, and they have a really beautiful view of Passamaquoddy Bay there. It's severely threatened by sea level rise. So in this work, we use multi-method approaches that are influenced by, again, community-based participatory research, indigenous research methods, as well as sustainability science. The Mitchell Center at the University of Maine is a key partner in doing sustainability science, and again understands this key to adaptation is based in community, social, and cultural resilience. So for me to present this work tonight, I wanted to use 2 framing pieces around culture, and I know one of my former colleagues, John Mattis, have presented some prior questions for this for my talk tonight, and this is going to address some of his concerns, some of what he's asking, which is really like, how can Wabanaki people help guide the state of Maine, and what does that look like in terms of really thinking about climate adaptation? And to me, that there are the frames of Wabanaki diplomacy that is both a definition of place, sort of where is what we refer to as Wabanagik, or the Dawnland. What is that relationship to climate adaptation, and how does it help as a ongoing set of diplomacies that stretch back hundreds of years? What kind of process, as it relates to this place, can we as Wabanaki people bring to the table? And the key part of this is, this is a grant. So the work started in this grant from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is a part of the Department of Interior. Hopefully Deb Haaland will be our next Secretary of Interior. but it's funded by the United States government in some level, in some way. So the grant is really located in, and you can see the tribes, the location of the tribes on the right here, and then the current land holdings by the tribes here in the state of Maine on the left. So I think, you know, that's was the kind of focus of the grant. These people, these resources, but of course, Wabanaki diplomacy defines us as a set of relations on a landscape that includes humans and non-humans that stretch across a much broader area than the state of Maine. So if you want to think about what the Dawnland is, what is Wabanaki, what is this territorial kind of context, it's this entire region, and that became very important to the kind of framing of action that we saw develop in this research grant. So we have 29, and I didn't use that map. I thought it was more interesting for you to see the territorial pieces, but there are 29 First Nation, Mi'kmaq First Nations in Canada, 1 Passamaquoddy, 6 Maliseet, and they are right. So the majority of us as Wabanaki people are actually across this supposed border. The other part of this is Wabanaki diplomacy as a process. I've given talks on this. I have a TED talk where I talk a lot about the process and sort of protocols involved in Wabanaki diplomacy. And it's been one of the really important parts of Wabanaki diplomacy is that it is actually rooted as a form of international law. It's always been a part of our relationships before even Europeans came here, our relations as different tribal nations with one another. And you see in a lot of this sort of early literature around international law concepts that develop as Europeans and seek to dominate groups of people and lands in North America and elsewhere. Our framing of international law and relations coming from our traditions, that appears very early on, and it kind of has influenced our confederacy, as well as the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, how we get along in an international context. And it's always been about how to solve very difficult problems that affect us across tribal nations. So these protocols have been developing for hundreds of years. They're kept as records of these diplomacies in wampum belts. The kind of apparatus of this probably became more formalized during colonization as we sought to defend ourselves against European powers as well. And you can see some of the scholars in point number 2 here, Willard Walker, Matthew Dennis, talk about the various forms that our confederacy and diplomacy has taken over time. Willard Walker talks about it as existing in at least 3 centuries in the minds of, I would say, hearts as well, of Wabanaki peoples. And Matthew Dennis also talks about this element of it being a kind of persuasive discourse, that the process and how to engage with others solving problems like this exists within our communities to today around how collective problems are addressed. And that's a really important part of decision making. If you look at the wampum records and the protocols, I know I'm going to mispronounce the Passamaquoddy, and I think Dwayne Toma was supposed to come on, so forgive me, Dwayne. But one of the key concepts in the protocols that appears in the wampum records is Zidagwen Dolewesdu. Everyone talks. This concept that everyone has a place and everyone should be heard is a critical part of these protocols, and how that functions is critical to the success of any of these kinds of engagements. So this process is to be taken very seriously in terms of addressing problems and solving problems related to broad landscape change across Wabanaki. So I want to share with you just a little bit of, and I'm not going to get into a lot of the tribal specific adaptation baselines, but I do want to share sort of across the Wabanaki Tribal Nations what we have found working with climate scientists, both from the University of Maine and elsewhere, other institutions and federal agencies, as well as with our traditional knowledge keepers across the Wabanaki community, sort of where we're identifying the climate threats and sort of how we're starting to think about them. So none of these, if you're paying attention to what climatic change we're facing, will be that surprising. Obviously, I'm going to emphasize a few of these over others: increased degree days, invasive species, of course. Yeah, many of us have witnessed the increase in winter ticks, and that's directly tied to the other one in bold, the potential loss of moose and other culturally important species. So this connection between winter ticks surviving in a more hardy way over warmer winters has really started to impact moose populations to a certain extent, and we're starting to try to understand the dynamics of that. A number of the tribes and hunters from the tribal communities are involved in research and other ways to understand this, the impacts of these winter ticks and other climate things, especially, and also another part of this increased erosion can also create other feedbacks along with more precipitation that would impact moose populations as well. Other key threats, of course, increase in water temperatures leads to impacts on fish and forest practices. So if you think about, with the Penobscot River Restoration Project, we've been able to have some fish returning along the Penobscot. That's been really amazing. Even the salmon are starting to return to a certain extent. But this will be, that progress will possibly be destroyed because of increased water temperatures. So that the fisheries will be impacted, forest practices. Some of the models I see in terms of the range of brown or black ash, which we make baskets out of, has a key cultural and economic impact. So some of those forecasts I see as brown or black ash moving north because of increased temperature, and both primarily because of air temperature. More invasive species, we have the emerald ash borer, other kinds of impacts as well. There, of course, climate transition zones will be changing in terms of, so it's not just these species moving north as temperatures rise, but they will move north and be kind of ripped from their ecological zones at different rates. So there will be disruptions also in the relationship between amongst and between non-humans as well. And these impacts of where it matters, subsistence, economics, health, and recreation, these are the critical 4 areas where impacts to cultural values will happen because of climatic change. What's interesting, of course, is as Natalie in particular started to bring together and visit the tribal communities across the state and get focus groups and interview critical people about their climate adaptation priorities. A lot of what came about in terms of where is our resiliency, we didn't even have to kind of frame it up that way. People were already thinking, like, in order for us to survive this, we have to fight these other battles, which are about against the loss of our language and stories. Like that's what's gonna get us through these very challenging climatic change years, as well as the sort of more institutionalization of that, fighting for food sovereignty and connections to food, sea mammals, moose, etc. Working to protect these healthy food webs to facilitate fish resources, work to protect cultural sites threatened by sea level rise and erosion. Things like the petroglyphs in Passamaquoddy Bay, various archaeological sites. These are high priorities of sort of where do we need to place our priorities. Of course, other resources brown ash, cedar, spruce, sweetgrass, maple trees, working to protect water quality and quantity, healthy soils for healthy foods. Again, this element of food sovereignty is very critical to community resilience. And this is not just for indigenous people, right? Moving forward through climatic change, people not relying upon food webs that are so distant from where they live creates various forms of resilience, especially, you know, places in Maine which are ostensibly food deserts. Really trying to increase this. The priority is also to write a Wabanaki Confederacy climate adaptation plan for a kind of political cultural action. Again, partly because of the network of Wabanaki women that exists and culture keepers that exists on both sides of this border, Natalie and others were able to mobilize this kind of zone of action on the political and cultural side across communities. And this created, you know, so not just here in Maine, our Wabanaki relations in what is now Canada as well, we all can share different things, and we are much stronger when we act together across this landscape, and this is an enacting of the diplomacy. So focus on what is common among us, and the food security. Maybe one community will do this and another community will do that. That actually is already happening in a certain way. The Micmacs have been doing a farm and a trout fishery. Passamaquoddies have maple syrup. Penobscots have community gardens, you know, other fisheries programs. There's a way to work together to create this collective food web and security. So sharing knowledge is critical to that, as well as working this leverage in the Confederacy to help one another. Also, the kind of work that people brought together in terms of the Wabanaki Confederacy is so these regional problems for cultural adaptation, very important. Listen to clan mothers and families to strengthen our identities, right? In order to be resilient, these are things that we need to invest time and energy in. I've been really heartened by the idea that we must take drastic steps to protect our land. You know, that, you know, I saw June is on here. Indigenous people are collectively acting across this landscape, literally putting their bodies on the line to protect the planet. And June went to Standing Rock, as did her others in her family. Really put their collective bodies and soul and the will on the line for these situations that are meant to protect our planet and to prevent further harm from occurring because of it. So this is not just some abstract set of political actions. This isn't just buying an electric car, right? This is about declaring our rights and acting around that. And that mood has been really consistent in working with across the communities. We've also talked about how do we use, especially because it's engaging with US and Canada, how do we use the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to link us and articulate action across this international boundary? The concept of free, prior, and informed consent is in this declaration, becomes really important and a powerful point of action for us as Indigenous people moving forward as we take on these issues, and really proclaim our responsibilities as Indigenous people through a multifaceted plan, taking on leadership roles. And some of that work is ongoing. I'll get to that in the next couple of slides. But really, you know, not waiting. The state of Maine just released its climate plan last week, I think, a week and a half ago. We're not waiting for them to act. I think it's good that they made action. I would love to see them be more partnering with the tribes in the state's work. But we are thinking much larger in a broader kind of context around this landscape for our action and the kinds of leadership we will take. So how are we addressing these climate adaptation needs? So for us, education on climate related topics for climate leadership and membership. There are a number of activities related to this, both, for us at the university, we have the Wabanaki Youth and Science Program, which connects indigenous youth in climate and other sciences with Western science professionals, as well as traditional knowledge keepers in our Wabanaki communities. And it uses and employs for both young and old. We're moving in different directions around this. Really bringing together different knowledge systems is a critical part of this work and action. And critical to this, much like place-based environmental education, these hands-on projects are really critical to that. So as we think about those projects, the intergenerational forms of education involving children in these sort of community climate projects are important, and to really think across a kind of integrated community planning. Tribes, like other governments, kind of divide up the world into different sectors, right? This is the environment, this is economic development, this is, so, at the forefront of this is bringing these all together for a different kind of planning. And Natalie and a number of other people are really trying to think that through. How might that look more broadly across and within our tribes? So I think that's also kind of critical part of us just decolonizing ourselves for this work. So I'm already at conclusions. Good. I was able to cut out enough of the piece to have some good Q&A time. So what's going on? Sort of where are we leaving this work? So that grant has ended, but we're still doing the dissemination work and building upon that. The United South and Eastern Tribes and the Northeast Climate Science Center, based out of UMass, have both really heavily dedicated to this work in Maine. And I think that's led, we were supposed to, here in Maine, host a regional indigenous climate camp this past July. It was canceled because of COVID. So it was rescheduled this coming July 2021, as being for a week-long sort of think tank of 10 to 12 tribal nations from across the region, the South and Eastern Tribes region, with the Penobscot Nation as a host, to really bring together kind of the key actors across the country and the globe to think through climate change adaptation work and planning here as it relates to not only our state, but our region, right? So the Wabanaki Dawnland region. So that we're very excited about that happening. It would have been nice to have happened in July, this past July, but we continue to refine what we'll do with that, and the outputs are going to be really promising. So, as a wrap up, of course, my colleague John Mattis asking what do Wabanaki people, what are some of the things that we can help bring to the discussion around climate change and climate change adaptation? I mentioned, of course, place, thinking more broadly across our landscape and those interconnections, I think will be an important part of how we identify both us as people and as our landscape, as well as how do you bring together and include sort of multiple nations to address this work, but tying it to landscape, I think, is a really important part of indigenous action, environmental action, regionally, nationally, and across the world. This, Standing Rock doesn't just happen as a local problem, right? It is a series of interconnections around the problem, fossil fuel extraction, et cetera, but it's also an adaptation that we have already made in connecting as Indigenous people and activists, and with non-Indigenous activists as well. So that place and process is an inclusive one at its core. It doesn't ignore the other people in this place, nor does it ignore anyone who has a stake in our climate future. Everyone must be involved in that. Another piece of work that we're currently working on, and Natalie is definitely the lead on this, is creating an climate adaptation planning that links to indigenous places and processes and traditions of environmental adaptation. We've been really inspired by tribes in the upper Midwest through the Great Lakes Indian Fish Commission, who developed a climate change adaptation menu. And they rooted activities for climate change adaptation in the cultural traditions. So, you know, we don't just think about, you know, building places on higher ground or creating systems of resilience in the way we build buildings or whatever. We're also thinking about how do we employ traditional environmental management methods such as burning or other kinds of plant management systems that are much slower in terms of their invasiveness, but are critical part of this work. And then lastly, and so it'd be great, you could have Natalie back to talk about this climate adaptation menu that we're working on. And lastly, the possibilities of adaptation and resilience need to be understood as part of climate and environmental justice. So what's interesting and troubling around the world is that the people being sort of forced into adapting to climatic change are often indigenous people or poor people. The powerful and those who have resources already have not yet really committed to more radical adaptation. And part of what I'm talking about is you know, the work that has been ongoing across the world in response to first the Kyoto Protocol and now the Paris Climate Accords. You know, protecting, for example, a lot of the work that's done to protect forests across the world often involve in terms of keeping trees, right, planted and in the ground. A lot of the adaptations to protecting these resources has been to kick out indigenous people and indigenous management and to really devalue that. So we're very, very aware that who adapts and how, and who has options and who has resources to adapt in this coming context is going to be very, very important. So I think, you know, that attitude of who changes, you change, not us, that's become a really important part of our engagement and sort of the political redefinitions of how to do this work and how to think about this work. So that's my presentation. I will end the show and stop my screen share. And it's there. It was about 36 minutes. So
No one was timing you, Darren.
that's all right.
It was great. Thank you. Powerful stuff. Lots to think about. It's so interesting. Yeah, I'm going to bring Kate on right now to bring you the Q&A. So there she is.
Thank you so much, Darren. I really appreciate your time. And I do notice, just in case people are mentioning it later, that there is an issue right now with Google and Gmail, so people might have an issue getting on. So if there's any response about why I couldn't get on, that could be part of it. We do have a question from Jeff Griffiths. What would the Wabanaki do that is different from what the state of Maine or the US federal government is trying to do or will do under President Biden?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and you know, part of this is, you know, it's a little unanswerable, but in terms of what the organizing is happening and the knowledge that we're pursuing as it relates to this work, it's precisely those kinds of things. It's a much more ecologically minded set of adaptations. It's more sensitive to landscape and culture and food sovereignty issues than it is about economic impacts of. I mean, I think, you know, the state, federal government, be that U.S., Canada, the discussions around climate change impacts are rooted primarily in broad economic impact. So protecting the fishing industry, protecting other kinds of sectors. It's not unrelated to, we looked at, there's tourism, there's cultural tourism, but being connected to place and really placing a value on our connection to places will really reimagines the possibilities of action. And I think this sort of treating our area, our ecological zones as interconnected across nation states, I think is also will create a different kind of set of actions. Again, part of that is, reestablishing and reimagining relations between Indigenous people and each other as Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, but also our relations with non-humans and how that connects. I know that's not a great policy answer, but I think establishing, starting small but very important elements of access and control by Indigenous people over lands and resources, and using these concepts of free, prior, and informed consent to think our way through these coming climate adaptations.
Thank you. A question from actually June, your colleague we were speaking about earlier. She says, "Kwe Darren, thank you for your presentation."
Kwe.
Kwe.
Kwe. It's like G. That's all right. Yeah.
Okay. Have you tied into any of this the land back movement?
Yeah, that's a great. So part of what June is talking about, and this is actually answers the earlier question as well, which is there's a movement, and it happens in different kinds of sectors, or different kinds of levels, where Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people are working together to repatriate our homelands as Indigenous people. So we have more control and access to traditional cultural resources. Some of this is work that June and others are involved with, rematriation, and it's purposely addressed as rematriation because it recognizes the role that our clan mothers as Wabanaki people had in sort of directing and managing our lands and resources. They're very different notions of property and management than the Euro-American traditions, for sure. And so that is work that is, works all the way from an individual landowner and seeking to work with an individual landowner to gain access and to have land and access points rematriated, all the way up to about a month ago, the Elliottsville the nonprofit Elliottsville, part of the Katahdin Woods and Waters, dedicated lands back to the Penobscot Nation that are traditionally ours. So that is in a relationship that's very important, regaining access and control over land that can happen at the tribal level. It can happen in terms of tribal government level, but also in terms of in these other cultural spaces like rematriation. There are more sort of more and less radical elements of land back movement. I think it is gaining great momentum within the land trust community and with individual landowners here in the state of Maine. And I see that as a really, I would brand it as a win-win situation where engaging people and the meaningfulness of our attachments to our landscapes in Maine can happen cross-culturally is a real win for protecting our lands for future generations.
Excellent. So this is a combination of questions here. There's it's related to planning for climate issues and thinking both on how Indigenous people are involved with the state of Maine, and then going even further and looking at it in how Indigenous peoples are part of the Paris Climate Accords.
Yeah. So actually today, yesterday and today, I'll start with the last part of it. There's an Indigenous part of the current meeting of parties related to the Paris Climate Accords. This is ongoing. I think the Paris Climate Accords, in terms of its mechanisms, I think people understand is a lot of nation states promising certain kinds of reductions, but in that are a continuation of a number of programs, including the ones I referenced in a negative way before, which are sort of protecting lands in ways that might not be very good for indigenous peoples. So I think the recognition of that some of those previous policies of, some rich European country paying, a poor developing country a certain amount of money to protect forests so they can cut down something or pollute something, right? That does not equal climate justice, right? So I think we are really compelled to see how do indigenous rights become a firm part of the Paris Climate Accord. That work is ongoing. There's lots of people who are very serious about that work. But I think there's a lot of momentum to it. Partly is the recognition that climate justice activists worldwide are really led, I won't say they're entirely, but are really led by indigenous people. So how can you do that without, really firm set and recognition of indigenous rights? It's still not there in the accords. We're hoping that it will be. It's a very major set of discussions happening. Now I forget the first part of that.
Is involvement for indigenous people in Maine climate
Yeah, so
change plans?
it's not been where I would like it to be. I think there have been moves recently to be more partnering as the Wabanaki Tribal Nations with the state. I think I'm hopeful that there will be more partnerships related to this work going forward, as the state of Maine just is now getting its sort of feet beneath it in terms of how to think about climate change work in a broad statewide way. Anyway, I haven't been super happy with what's been going on. There are various subgroups, and there have been more and more, I think, indigenous and Wabanaki participation. But that was started out in a pretty small way. But I'm seeing more engagement as we move forward.
Excellent, thank you. We have a couple more questions, but what I think being aware of your time and those of our attendees, that we could maybe answer some of those questions and then send those to the attendees as later on. And for example, things like recommending some read more about it books or resources to learn more is a possibility. And then also there's a more specific question, but then another question that's important is how can we help support these efforts, especially if we don't have a lot of money? So those are things that we could have a response. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I think there are a couple of things. Of course, there are moves have been moves in the state legislature to fix the legacies of the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act here in the state, and a number of the fixes are related to our control of our natural resources and waters in particular. But so as those bills will come up again. First, it was a big bill of 22 points. And I think, there's a push to kind of separate out into 3 different bills. That will appear in the next legislature. So please pay attention to that work. It's directly related to our ability as Wabanaki people to shape our climate futures here in the state of Maine. So you can write to your representatives, really engage in this process. I think that's always, now that and I'm happy to, I can put on links, send you guys links to, so where the text of those bills really interacts with this. And then connected to that is this Wabanaki group that is formed across the tribal nations here in the state called the Wabanaki Alliance. So if you go to wabanakialliance.com, they're also, it's a good resource to sort of understand the nature of what these fixes are to the Settlement Act, as well as opportunities to engage to support different programs within that through financial and other means. So wabanakialliance.com is a place to visit for both information and ways to help. And then broadly, I really encourage people to engage more deeply in discussions and education. The Wabanaki Reach group, which is a legacy of our truth and reconciliation process here in the state of Maine, they do regional trainings across the state at different moments, and you can really get a sense of not only Wabanaki kind of relationships to place, but sort of the elements of loss that we have felt through various forms of historic traumas and bad actions by state and other actors over the last several hundred years. So you can really get a feel for that through their training. And I think that deeper understanding isn't going to happen with me talking for 40 minutes on Zoom. I think a lot of what they do is really phenomenal work of, working with almost, each person's journey to understand in a more deep way these relationships and these histories.
Thank you. Thank you. Do you want to ask Don Perkins' question, Kate? It looks like there's one more there.
Sure. Thank you for your overview of your people's integrated adaptation process. With the Penobscot Nation attuned to the rivershed and Pleasant Point community attuned to the bay, would you speak to how you're thinking about wild and cultured seafood, plant, fish, and mammal as a part of your food security strategy?
Yeah, and I think, this connects with a bunch of different things. Thank you for that. That's a really good question. In some ways, it connects to, it can only be made sense of or real by some of the things that June asked about the land back. So this notion of our connections to places, as well as, I think of the Penobscot River Restoration Project, which removed, a couple of major dams on the lower Penobscot, created better and more fishways, and with that, a return of fish in a scale, especially anadromous fish, on a scale that we haven't seen in over 100 years. That is really, to me, what you would think of, I think of as an indigenous future. So projects like that, Penobscot Nation was critically involved in it, but it wasn't just Penobscot Nation, it was all, Nature Conservancy, all these other groups, the state, federal government, even the industries that were sort of reshaping their energy production. That's an all hands on deck kind of work, but at its core was people willing to really say, I can imagine a different and more productive landscape that puts indigenous people and values at its center. That was never like how we sold. It was sold as the Penobscot River Restoration Project, but with that, it's hard to imagine that happening without the Penobscot Nation and other entities. But really thinking about what does an indigenous future landscape look like? It's not the same as before Europeans got here. I'm not like that. That's not how I think. But I do think at its core, an indigenous future must be a part of our survival as a species on this planet. And so I think there are these moments where we see this coming together, on the political end, things like Standing Rock, our activism around our river and the River Restoration Project. I think these are these moments that are that kind of higher frequency possibility. And I think you all being kind of sensitive to that, moving forward, it will be really helpful.
Well, thank you, Darren. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This was really
I'm only into my 9th hour on Zoom today, so the fact that I was able to keep things going is a testament to your goodwill, I think.
Well, yeah. And you still have one more to go, right?
Yeah. Sherry Mitchell and I are cooking up something in a little bit. So I strongly encourage everyone to read her book and engage with her work. She's maybe if you haven't had her as a speaker, that would be great.
We would love to have her as a speaker. She was going to speak here a couple of years ago and it just didn't work out. So we'd love to have her. Tell her we said hi.
I will. I mean, I'm just some nerdy academic type. She's the deep thinker here. We really we really need healers out there, you know, really thinking through that kind of process, and she's great at that.
Well, thank you so much, Darren. This was wonderful.
Yeah,
We can't thank you enough.
my
It was
pleasure.
our honor to have you here, and thanks everybody who came. Everybody stay well, be kind, as Dr. Shaw says at the end of his COVID talks. I think that's really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, be well.
Be well. Take care.
Bye.
Happy holidays.
Stay tuned.